YouTube video. It cut off we got 25 minutes, and then just mid-sentence we just lost the feed. So John assures me the camera's going to be replaced, and tonight, bear with us if we have to pause and make sure it's working. We want to. So if you're watching on YouTube and you don't come to these, sorry, and bear with us. We'll get it as much as we can to you. So, okay, so a fair amount of where we ended last, half of last Wednesday was just cut for anyone trying to catch these up on YouTube. So we'll back up a little bit and just review, but we're going to review a little bit anyway. Last week I emphasized the idea that temples in the ancient world were thought to be not just the places where the deity could be embodied among the people in the form of an idol, right? Usually the idol statue was thought to, the god, particular god that dwelt in that temple was thought to inhabit or embody that statue. And there, the deity was represented, and he could be, brought his offerings, sustained with food, bring him drinks, appeal to him for things, and try to manipulate and get them on your side, for lack of a better way of saying it. That's pretty much how ancient pagan worship worked. We'll get into some of that in a moment. But temples were built according to what was thought to be a cosmic pattern. We talked about this from Hebrews, and so the creation account in Genesis 1, moving into Genesis 2, is patterned after a temple building or temple dedication ceremony. It looks like the creation of the cosmos in Genesis is designed to look like a sort of liturgical service that brings you to the conclusion of, now the temple is constructed. When the temple is constructed, you consecrate the idol statue in the sanctuary, and then it sort of comes to life, or the deity inhabits the idol, or something like that, and then you're rolling. Then your God, right, your pagan ancient deities, could use that as their operational center to maintain justice and cosmic order on the earth, from that particular city or locality. And of course, there are temples all over the ancient world, so every local area had their own, or kingdom. Usually it's citywide. You have a city patron deity of a city. And that's kind of just the default assumption of the way it was thought to work. And then the biblical story is telling a version of that presents the ideas in a way that looks very similar to their ancient pagan neighbors. Except a lot of the meaning, the theological interpretation of what's happening and why it's being done is going to be wildly different. And those are the areas we're going to drill down into and look at just why does this look so similar if you read ancient Near Eastern pagan literature, but also why does the Bible slide these, what look like subtle differences in, and they change the whole dynamic. In fact, the whole course of history is changed by some of this stuff, I'm going to argue. It's endlessly fascinating, and there's a lot of detail we could get into. Last week we did a pretty quick run through. I was just a flood of information focusing on the idea that ancient temples were seen as models of the cosmos. They were a microcosmic representation of the cosmic order itself. A place where the gods interacted and joined heaven and earth. So this has a lot to do with the divine right of kings to rule over a particular territory. It has to do with how humans thought the gods operated within nature, within the earthly realm that they inhabited, things that they couldn't understand. They didn't look for explanations that had to do with physics and chemistry and biology. They looked for explanations that we would call supernatural, right? And they didn't make those distinctions between natural and supernatural. And a big way that they did that was go to the temple, bring your offerings, entreat the priests, whatever, get the right incantation if you can. Normal people typically didn't do divination ceremonies or know the proper training or have the incantations to speak, nor could they offer offerings on their own. It was all mediated through priesthood. And that was all a cosmic hierarchy, if you will. Is that, you follow me? So the gods are up there. They rule from the heavens. They have emissaries or functionaries or, messengers or whatever that they send out and represent them. And when it comes to humans, the idea was try to bridge that gap. And one of the ways you did that was a priesthood. There are other things we could talk about there. But all that, the Bible has versions of this happening. It's just not assuming the same things that the pagans are assuming. But the culture represents the culture that it's right next to. They're not culturally totally different. So cultural elements are just shared. And that comes out in this idea of the heavenly order of the cosmos finding its expression in temples where the gods rule from earth. That's absolutely a biblical idea. You just got to interchange the parts where it's the pagan idea for the biblical one. And then the second half of the study last week was about how when Israel experiences, or rather Moses, as Israel's representative, experiences the appearance of God on Mount Sinai, that experience is central to not just the book of Exodus, but to the whole biblical story in many ways. And what comes from that is God instructing Moses, have the people build me a tabernacle so that I may dwell among them. And this was a question that came up actually last week. It's a good opportunity to address it. That was not the first time that God had encountered humans in his visible personal presence after the fall of Adam and Eve, after Adam and Eve are exiled off the mountain out of the garden. It's not the first time God appeared to someone and encountered them in some what we call a theophany, right? An appearance of the glory of God. It happens, right off the bat. You have Cain and Abel, and they're obviously interacting with God in some way through an altar of sacrifice. Then Noah, then Abraham. Abraham's doing sacrifices here, sacrifices there, and then Mount Moriah in Genesis 22, when he is told to bring his son Isaac up the mountain. That's a sacrificial temple story. It resembles what would happen in the temple later. We may cover this very briefly when we get to King David. But this idea of God encountering people on mountains in a temple-like setting is not new and doesn't appear in Exodus when Moses goes up to Mount Sinai. So that's not the novelty of that. The novelty of it is when God tells him, hey, I want you to build me this tent, and there I will dwell with my people. Those were all encounters where he appeared and visited, usually an individual. This is going to be unique because, first of all, it's going to be his dwelling place among humanity, not just a visit. Secondly, it's not going to be with just a single Israel, a single faithful follower like Moses, like Abraham, like Noah. It's going to be with all of Israel. It's a democratic sort of visitation, and that is remarkable. That's not the kind of thing in the ancient world that you thought of and thought, well, yeah, we all get to go and hang out at God's house. That was the divine right of kings. That was the place of priesthood and priesthood only. And we'll talk about the distinctions of priesthood and common Israelites in a moment. But understand, there's a way in which they're combined. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests, right? That was the actual idea. Some of the distance between Israel and the divine glory was their choice. We don't want to get too close to this, right? The thunder and the trumpets and the smoke and the fire and the glory. No, you talk to him and you come tell us what to do. We don't want to get too close lest we die. That's not exactly God saying, I don't want to have anything to do with these commoners. Send me a royal representative. It's right. It's a little complicated, but that alone is something worth pondering. In any case, what happens on Mount Sinai in Leviticus 9, when the glory cloud comes out and consumes the sacrifice after Moses and Aaron have completed all these ritual sacrificial procedures as they were instructed in Leviticus 1 through 8. When that's all complete, then this glory fire comes out, and the sort of a visible manifestation of God's glory is transferred in the narrative sense of it. It's transferred from the mountain on Mount Sinai, from high on Mount Sinai up in the heavens, to the tabernacle. And that makes the tabernacle what scholars refer to as a portable Mount Sinai. It is literally a way that they can take the glory of the Sinai experience and God's presence there with them and tote him along with them in the wilderness. Right? That's a little bit of a flippant way of saying it, but Mount Sinai is replayed every time the tabernacle is set up and the proper procedures are followed and you got a worship ceremony going on. That's a new Mount Sinai. It's a recreation of Mount Sinai. And given that Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, which is a reference to Eden, remember from Ezekiel, given that Mount Sinai was a recreation of the Garden of Eden, that's a substantial narrative through line. That makes this story being told there really, really rich with deep symbolism. It's not just that this is the best we can do in a fallen reality, is we'll have some way to worship God in this place, and he'll be here in some fashion or other. It is a way for Israel to recreate Eden and relive it in a new Mount Sinai experience, which was its own sort of revisitation to the mountain, to the Garden of Eden up on the mountain. You have to look for these details and read carefully, and we're not going to go back through all that, but just as a quick summary to catch us up, these are really profound ideas, and the narrative, as a story is sort of woven together, this stuff gets really, really clever. It's quite sophisticated. It always helps to step back and see that big picture unfolding, because as tonight I want to slow us down a little bit and drive into some of the details, particularly of Leviticus, which I know is not everybody's favorite read through the Bible section, but as you get into these details, they're fascinating. And I'm going to draw out as much as I can. We'll have to pick and choose how much we go into and how closely we atomize it all. But as we do that, never forget the big story being told is actually just as important to keep in mind as discovering little truths in the details. So for all of that, here's where we ended up with. This is just a summary. Oh, sorry, Paul, go ahead.
Did pagans copy that? Or did they have something going before that?
So most of the concepts, when we talk about commonalities, say cultural or religious commonalities between pagan culture and Israelite culture, most of those are just, it's not clear in every case which one came first. A lot of cases we do know the pagan, let's say, stories, creation narratives, for example, things like the Epic of Gilgamesh and stuff like this. We know that predates, the best scholarly estimates are they predate the biblical text. I tend not to think about it in terms of who's copying from whom. What's really usually, I think, going on, and there's a lot of debate and discussion about this, I'll just give you my take on it. What's usually going on is that where biblical story looks like pagan story, it's not really always a matter of one copying from the other. Which one came first is not totally important to me, although usually it's the pagan stories that, at least in terms of literature, probably predate the biblical text being written. But you're talking about a lot of this stuff, it's oral tradition anyway. It ended up as a written text, but it developed from oral traditions in any case. But what's really key is probably that it's just more like the way cultural ideas are floating around. They're just in people's consciousness. They just understand how the world works. It's more passed down. It's more a part of the tradition. It's more just a part of where you live and how you're situated and how you live. So it depends on the particular details we wanted to talk about, but I would just say broadly, most of it's just common culture. And the Bible doesn't take what they have in common with pagan ideas and say, well, we can't make it sound like that because it'll be pagan. It's like, no, the worldview is different. But a lot of the cultural points of contact are the same, right? And we understand this because we live in a highly multicultural society. But we all share common things that if you walk out on the street during the World Series week, right? And you just start talking about the Dodgers and the Yankees. Someone from Japan might not have the first clue what you're talking about. Someone from Zimbabwe almost certainly wouldn't. But here we're just like, yeah, okay. Maybe if you're not a baseball fan, you probably know what those team names mean, what the mascots are, you know. It's just a point of cultural context. So some of the concepts are like that. And that's probably about the most I could say about it to make it broadly make sense, just in broad strokes. There's a lot more, you know, there's a lot of debate about this stuff, but generally it's just like points of contact that they shared in common. And God doesn't change the whole vocabulary and storytelling method of his people because he wants to communicate a truth. He will say what they're doing is not the true theologically correct version of this story, but he will use the same style elements and sometimes storytelling features to tell us, right, to make that theological truth. So that's the best sort of short summary I could give to that answer. But it's a good question because it does, sometimes it stumbles people like, wait a minute, this sounds too much like the pagan story or the pagan ideal of worship. It can't be that because you know, we're monotheists, and it's like, it doesn't create that kind of problem if you don't let it. And I think we usually we know stuff like that intuitively if we stop and think about it. Christian music's a good example. Like, how much is Christian music really Christian? You say all the lyrics. Well, we're singing to and about Jesus, and like, well, first of all, that's not always true, but that's another subject. But even so, like, okay, but formally, you know, sometimes you can't tell the difference. It sounds like pop culture, pop music. Sometimes it sounds like bad pop culture, pop music. Sometimes it sounds pretty good, and these are talented artists. But you know what I mean? The substance is what matters. If the substance is good, it's worship. And the form is, I won't say it doesn't matter, but the form is less relevant. And you get the same kinds of things with how the biblical story unfolds. Okay, so when we get to the instructions for the tabernacle, and God appears in the midst of the people in Leviticus 9, here is the sort of symbolic template we are working with at that point. The tabernacle is like a new Mount Sinai. It's just going to be a mountain that moves, right? That's the way to think about it. So every time you're coming west to come to the entrance gate of the tabernacle facility, you go through the curtain to get to the altar. Then if you're a priest, you can go further into the sanctuary. And then if you're the high priest, once a year, you can go deep into the Holy of Holies. Think about that progression, that that route, not just as going in, but as going up. Right? We're going to start think about these things in terms of ascending, and I'm going to highlight this in a moment. So all these, if you're vigorously jotting down notes, I can send you this, or you can access the slideshow anytime, or I think John's going to post them with the YouTube videos, or send them out on the web, on the email list. So don't worry about losing this. I'll get it to you if you really want it. This is just a sort of summary. And what we may try to come back to these maybe next week, or I don't think we'll have time tonight, but some of the actual symbolism at work in the construction and the furniture and the design of the tabernacle itself. But we talked about some of that last week, so I'm going to keep moving forward. Let's get to the purpose of this whole thing, this whole idea, which is God's idea, remember. Build for me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. And so for a lot of tonight, what I'll do is, as I said, get into some of the details of the text and some of the ways that it helps to make sense of this stuff, because, you know, ancient ideas of animal sacrifice and these ritual actions and the prescriptions for exactly how the priests are supposed to do everything and who can do what and what are all the laws about, they can be sort of daunting and confusing for modern readers. They just don't fit well for most of our daily lives. We don't do stuff like this. Like the distance between the food we have on our table every night and what it took to get that food there, for us is like, it's it's inconceivable compared to what ancient people had to go through to get just a meal on the table, right? We don't know anything about animal slaughter, about animal butchery. And I had my oldest son killed an elk last year, about a year ago or so, and I brought this thing home and butchered it out with the whole thing myself, and it about killed me. Like, I started to think there must be a reason that the priests in the tabernacle were excused from, they were limited in service when they turned 50. And I think part of that must be, because after, like, I'm pushing 50, and man, butchering a whole side of an animal like that, it's a ton of work. I was just exhausted, things hurt. It took me 2 full nights. It was crazy.
Was your freezer big enough?
Yeah, we got a big freezer, thank God, but the labor alone is just grueling. They're doing this all the time, constantly, right? People bring the animals. The people would actually cut the throats of the animals, the worshiper, but then everything gets turned over to the priests, and they handle, I know they handle the blood, and I think mostly they're the ones, like, they're sort of professional butchers. That's a big part of their job description. And we just can't conceptualize doing that as a regular practice of our daily lives, let alone that's what the people in ministry are doing, right? We think about clergy and laity and what pastors do and what normal Christian, that doesn't fit, right? It doesn't compute. So it can be overwhelming. I find just trying to carefully sort through the vocabulary helps a lot. It helps clarify things. And some of this, and I don't want to make this sound too negative, but some of it is you get translation problems pretty commonly when you dig into this content. Translators have just not always captured what sometimes you can't capture from a translation from a language like Hebrew into English or almost any other language, but sometimes they're just bad translations. Like, they just don't work. I would say bad. Some of them are bad. Most of them just don't work as well as they should. And although, there will be a couple points where I'll point out, I will be pretty pedantic and say, I insist this is how we understand and translate this. Mostly it's just like you can enhance what's being presented if you just dig and get a little more accurate view of the Hebrew text. And that's hard to do, it takes some work, but scholarship and language learning has advanced to the point where even a schlub like me who doesn't actually know Hebrew, you can get a lot of meaning out of it if you put the work in. But it does take work, and I'm going to move you through some of it. Right off the bat, when we talk about what we're talking about, well, God says to Moses, have them build for me a sanctuary so that I may dwell among them. That gives you your 2 key vocabulary words, or 2 of the 3. The sanctuary is the holy place. Let them build for me a mikdash. Mikdash is just a noun form of the Hebrew verb kodesh, to make holy, to make something holy. So just let them make for me a holy place. Why? Because I want to mishkan. I want to dwell among. This will be a mishkan from the Hebrew verb shachan, to dwell or to reside. This will be the place where I want to dwell, and there's a connection there. If God is dwelling in a place, ipso facto, by virtue of the fact of His presence, it becomes holy. Right? You follow me? Why is it a holy place? It's not just because He declared it to be. That's part of how you sanctify something. If God declares something holy, it is. But in this case, it's actually much more than that. It's like, no, if His presence is there, that's it. The definition is set. It's a holy place. So those 2 terms help you right along. But it also explains a lot of the purpose of the tabernacle. And this is something a lot of Christians don't always tend to. But they just have different assumptions about what's going on with this whole ritual system and slaughtering all these animals. And it sounds burdensome. I just talked to you about, like, just butchering the animal. It sounds like a lot of work. And that causes, sometimes there's a default assumption in sort of Christian thinking that, oh, this stuff was the law that we're all saved from because it was really burdensome and hard, and now we don't have to do any of it. And, I'm not going to say sign me up for, I like a good barbecue, but I don't want to be doing this stuff. Like, I don't like killing animals much. I'll butcher them, I like cooking, and I certainly like eating them. I'm not saying there's no truth to that, but the logic of the system is not give them really hard, nasty, burdensome things to do, so that when grace comes, they will understand that they've been set free from all these hard things. That I will say is absolutely not the idea. The logic of the system is, I want to dwell with these people. So I'm going to have them make for me a place. Then I'll dwell with them because it's going to be a holy place. The point of that, and I think I mentioned this last week, but it's worth repeating, is these people that I've already saved by grace, I've already brought them out of slavery from Egypt and manifested myself, presented myself and entered into covenant with them at the mountain. I want to continue that intimacy of the mountain on an ongoing basis where they can walk around, I can walk around with them. That's remarkable. That is a grace-based theological system. And again, sometimes, depending on your Christian tradition, that's just not understood, or it's just assumed to be something in sharp contrast. Now, there is a contrast. We talked about the book of Hebrews. Hebrews makes this whole midrashic sort of creative teaching about Jesus as superior to this whole system. But it is not a contrast of good versus bad. And I hope, if nothing else is clear, by the time we get done here, you'll see that I want to disabuse that notion and just leave it where it belongs. It's already God in his grace reaching out to be present with his people. And that alone distinguishes it from other ancient systems of worship. That was not the way people thought in the ancient world. You don't have to love your God. You don't have to believe in your God. You don't have to have you couldn't have a relationship with your God. No ancient pagan religion thought in those terms. Not in ancient Israelite society, or not near ancient Israelite society, and not in first century Rome. All you were concerned with was getting the ritual procedures right, and having the priest say the right words, and hoping that they did what you wanted them to do. There was no relationship really to speak of. And just God saying, I want to dwell among them, automatically turns this into a relationship. You could go a little deeper here if you wanted to, because the Mount Sinai, is when the covenant is inaugurated, is seen as a wedding ceremony. God is betrothing Israel to himself. And then if you think about the Tabernacle as that sort of ongoing Mount Sinai, I think that imagery really works. I haven't developed this fully, so, take it or leave it. But think of a marriage. Rather, think of a wedding where the contract is inaugurated, where it's entered into. But then you have the wedding night, which experientially actually consummates that relationship. And if that were the last time husband and wife, who were now joined together in this covenant, were intimate, I'm not sure that would even, it might be a state-sanctioned legitimate marriage, but it wouldn't be a good one. It wouldn't be a real one, right? It's the ongoing intimacy that marks the ceremony that we have entering into covenant as fully what it's supposed to be. So you can think of the tabernacle as that. It's the ongoing intimacy of Mount Sinai. God taking his betrothed as his bride, his people as his bride. But if you stop there and said, okay, now you're on your own, that's a weird relationship, right? So it's fully relational, this whole system. And I think that's just something that a lot of Christians sort of miss or don't think about, and we want to really highlight what's going on there. The other term that's used throughout the Torah is the Ohel Moed. Ohel is a Hebrew term for tent, and it is literally something like the tent of meeting, which is how it usually gets translated, or the tent of assembly. And that's straightforward enough, but as we sort of ended last week, you realize God's glory is on the mountain, then his glory is sort of transferred to the tabernacle. It appears at the altar. When that happens, there's an interesting, in between those two events, you have an interesting problem. The end of Exodus, literally the very last verse of Exodus. Oh, here, I have it for you. Yeah, Exodus 40. It's the very end of the book. This whole story. You've been consumed with chapter after chapter after chapter of instructions for how to build the tabernacle, and then details about building the tabernacle, etc. It's a long, kind of boring to read section. It's repetitive. And when that's finally all sort of done, here's what happens. Exodus 40, verse 35. or verse 34. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. This is like the goal we've been heading toward. If you're reading Exodus, you're like, finally, all these instructions. When's God going to show up? Okay, His glory shows up, and Moses can't go in there precisely because His glory has shown up. It's dangerous. You can't just be where God is. That's dangerous, right? But this creates a tension, like a paradox. The point was to get God's presence to come here where we are. Then the goal is, His presence is here. And now the reality is, okay, well, now none of us can really dwell in that presence. It's scary and dangerous, and we'll die. He's too glorious. He's too charged with holy fire. And what do? And this is kind of strange paradox that presents. Which means it is a Mishkan, a Mikdash. It's the holy place. It's the sanctuary because it's been made holy by His presence. But it is not an Ohel Moed. It's not a tent of meeting because no one can meet there, right? The people can't meet together, and they certainly can't meet with Yahweh because, well, glory fire. That stuff's dangerous. God's presence Himself is dangerous. And there's this problem. So when you consider from there, sorry, go ahead. Okay, we can start.
Battery died.
Okay, it's just shut down?
Yeah.
No.
Do we have a charging cord or something? Or?
We'll just keep going.
Okay.
You're on my phone, hopefully.
Oh, good, thanks, Ingrid. Okay, so when you then get to Leviticus, all the procedures are set up, is that glory comes down to the tabernacle, consumes the offerings, and the people are there and they see it and they fall on their faces and they worship, right? This is, Leviticus 9. Verse 24, fire comes out from before the Lord, consumes the burnt offering and the pieces of fat on the altar, and when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. That's a signal that, okay, rituals have been approved, the sacrifices are going to be accepted, and instead of God's glorious presence coming out and consuming anyone who's in the path, it will consume the animals in their place. It's a substitutionary idea. We mentioned this last week. That seems to be the starting point of the whole system. Like the logic of the whole system seems to be anchored in this idea. That since God's presence is dangerous because in Himself He is so holy that He endangers anyone not on His level of holiness, some accommodation has to be made. And He makes a couple accommodations. One is He can sanctify people and give them holy status so that they can come into His presence. And He'll do that. That's what the priesthood is, essentially. But another is the animal, not always animals, but mostly, as we'll talk about animals, seems to take the place of the human so that the animal being brought on the altar, and again, and also the altar is actually itself meant to be like a mini mountain. So even that has mountain imagery attached to it. The animal going up on the altar is a substitute for the worshiper going up into God's presence. That seems to be how the logic of the system works. And a lot of this, you'll see, remains consistent, but you have to sort of know what you're looking for to see it. That gets to the point where, like, how does this work then? And to explain that, we have to start defining some of the terms. This is another area that sometimes we just blend language of holiness and purity, and we treat it like just one long run-on word, right? Like they're the same thing in a lot of, again, sort of Christian or modern thinking. Ideas of holiness and purity just means being morally good. And that's not really the logic of the system. Now, the New Testament is going to take holiness language and purity language, and it's going to give it a lot more emphasis in the ethics of Jesus. That's true. It takes a lot of this language, this vocabulary, and it's going to explain it in ethical and theological terms. In the logic of the Levitical system and the Tabernacle, first of all, they are quite distinct things. They don't just mean the same, they're not synonyms. And what is actually being described is pretty precise in most cases. And this is another area, again, like we tend to just, as moderns, think, well, these ideas are kind of primitive and, you know, a little irrational. What sense does this make? Why can you eat a chicken but not a rock badger? It's one of the weird animals in Leviticus that I don't even know what a rock badger is. Why can you eat certain animals but not others? Why, when you get to laws about purity, is a woman's menstrual cycle defiling? She didn't do anything wrong. Why is childbirth, like one of the greatest things in human life, considered a defiling act and has to be atoned for? The logic of the system only works if you dig out the meaning and if you don't think in always moral or ethical terms. Many of the defiling, the things that defile have nothing to do with behavior that is moral or immoral, right? That's not to say they're not related, they are, but we're just working through this in this way. It doesn't seem rational. Not all these things have a rational basis in why one thing is defiling and how does something become holy. And so that, for modern readers, tends to be like, well, that's kind of why it's weird and we're glad we don't have to do it anymore. But I'm going to suggest there's a lot more to it than that. But to understand it, it has to be read not as a rational explanation of things that we want answers to, but as a symbolic worldview, right, that sees reality in a different way. The funny thing is, most of us have this sort of approach to a lot of things. We just don't know what we're doing when we do it. Leading into it, I'll just summarize, lay it out up front, and we'll get into some details and give examples. But purity, so holiness I've already mentioned. Holiness is something that in its essence only God truly possesses in himself, right? He is the sort of ultimate reality, and that makes him the definition of holiness. We tend to think, when we come to texts like Leviticus, we tend to think of holiness as separateness, something being different, separate from another. And that's true, but that's more like a result, or that's more like the result of what holiness does, is it makes separations, it makes distinctions. Holiness itself is more like this, something like a power or energy that only God possesses. And then he can grant certain things or objects or people the status of holy, and therefore that sets them apart from other things that are not holy. And the term for something not being holy, the antiquated term is profane, but profane has come to take on like a negative, like an automatically negative meaning. And really what it just means is common. It's something that's not holy, therefore it's common. There's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's not holy. It's not been sanctified. It has not taken on that status of holiness. And you can think of holy status, whether it's an object or a thing or a place or time, right? There's sanctified time just as there's sanctified space. You can think about that in terms of what it really does is it confers it conveys ownership. If something is sanctified, that essentially, a little bit too simplistic, but essentially means God owns it, right? He's taken ownership of it. He has called it his, or you can think of it's consecrated now for his use. That's a simple version. We'll get into more details, and this is the kind of thing that's easier to give examples of than it is to just explain. Purity, then, is the idea. Purity is an interesting concept because, again, modern thinkers tend to read a word like purity or clean and unclean. I use pure and impure, I just think that's a little more accurate. But clean and unclean, we hear the language and we start to think usually in terms of hygiene, ideas like health. We think in terms like bacteria and viral infections and contagious diseases. Impurity in the Bible is treated like a contagion. It is thought in the conceptual world of the ancient thinkers that lived in this world. It is thought to travel like a contagion, but they didn't have any concept of infectious diseases. They didn't have any idea of the biology at work here or the pathophysiology of how disease spreads. Like none of that was in their conceptual or cognitive world. They thought about more like spiritual forces or what was called a miasma, like just bad JoJo that could travel, right? One of my favorite ways to explain this is, but you have to be of a certain age to even know what I'm talking about, most of you probably are, is the Peanuts comic strip. Remember Pigpen?
Yeah.
The kid just walks around exuding dirt, right? It's just every time he's in a frame. Pigpen, everyone knows, is just emitting impurity. That's actually how the system seems to work in its, again, symbolic logic. And we just have a hard time getting our heads in that conceptual space, but that really is kind of how it works. We'll explain more of this as we go. So some of it seems weird to us. It's things like blood. It's almost any bodily fluid emission is defiling. So when you get to Leviticus 12 and on, you have things like menstrual blood, childbirth, male seminal emissions, any intercourse, or STD emissions. Like all that is defiling, not for any moral connotations that it brings. The logic seems to just be a symbolic one, and we can get into some of the symbolism in the coming, maybe next week, a little bit more depth. But one of the ideas is substances coming out of bodies. Again, just think like an ancient thinker. If substance comes out of a body, it's like the life force of that body, right? The person is losing life substance. This is why blood is so central. The life is in the blood, which is stated directly in Leviticus 17. It goes back to Genesis 9, right? You shall not eat the life with the blood. Anything like that seems to be, again, in the symbolic worldview, a loss of potential life. And the sanctuary is a place of God's presence, which means not only is it a holy place, but it is a place of utter life. Nothing but life. Wholeness of life. So this is much more about life, ideas, conceptions of life, holiness, wholeness, something being fully integrated. And if you start thinking that way, it will help at least a little bit. These things make sense. We have our own modern versions of what things we think of as dirty or filthy or defiling. And they don't always follow any rational sense of why that would be, right? So you're looking out the window, and especially in October, and you see the leaves on the trees, and they start to change color. And that's just like a leaf on a tree is beautiful. A leaf changing color on a tree is usually more beautiful. You see the leaves falling, and that's beautiful. And so leaves are always, in almost every context out there, beautiful. If the other day I got home, parked my truck in the driveway, windows were down, I left the windows down, I went in, I think I ate lunch or was doing something. I came back out just like half an hour later, and the wind had blown a bunch of leaves into my truck. That's annoying. Now my truck is dirty. If they blow into your house and they get on the floor, you sweep those things out where they belong, because now your house is dirty. They're not dirty. You look at the tree and don't think, look at those dirty leaves. You think, look at those beautiful leaves. That's the idea of purity and impurity and how it pertains to holiness and sacred space, right? Something like that. This is, I think, an example that Mary Douglas uses. She's an anthropologist, actually, not a biblical scholar, but she contributed a lot to biblical scholarship with her study of this kind of stuff. She She has a book called Purity and Danger, and she uses examples like this, and you're like, oh yeah, intuitively you know, there's no rational reason to think that leaves out there are dirty, but leaves in here, or leaves out there are fine and beautiful, but in here they're dirty. There's nothing to the leaf. The leaf's not the problem. It's things out of place. It's the order of how things should be and where they should be and when they should be being disrupted that we consider filthy. And there are a lot of things in our lives that are like that, and we don't always have good logical explanations for why they should be like that. We just know that they are. I'll give you one of my favorite examples of this. This is what I always do when I'm teaching about this. Some version of this. I borrowed these from my daughter. If I am up here talking about ritual purity and Leviticus and biblical textual analysis and trying to give you guys deep truths from God's word and encourage us and how can we know him better, understand his word, and I showed up like this and just plowed forward the whole time. I'm first of all curious if anybody would ever say anything. But secondly, you would all know and be thinking, what is wrong with this guy? Why? These are my daughters, right? We have a bond. It's cute. It's kind of funny. And I don't know, maybe I like them. Or I think I look sweet. You would know this does not belong, right? These are ridiculous. First of all, if I were wearing my sunglasses, it would be weird. Like a little weird. Pretty weird. Right? It's night. It's dark. Doing a Bible study, why are you wearing your sunglasses? But these sunglasses, for goodness sake, everyone would know intuitively, right? This would not be explained to you. You would wonder what was wrong with that guy. It's either a gag, it's a joke, or like he's non-compass mentis. Something has blown, right? The fuse is blown. Why? It's not immoral for me to wear the sunglasses I choose to wear. I'm not hurting anybody. There's no issue of logic involved in why I shouldn't be able to do that. Maybe it helps me concentrate, gives me emotional support. The answer is because it's inappropriate. For what we're doing here and the position that I'm in and the task that we're about here, it doesn't fit. It's out of place. It disrupts the order. It brings disorder into what is supposed to be an ordered space in this sanctified, this time that we set apart to do what we're doing here. And it just doesn't belong. And things like that we tend to understand very well, and it doesn't need explained. And I'm just going to suggest, read Leviticus through, and I'll go through some examples, and you start to see the same type of logic. They're not always answering the questions that we would like answered. That's because they don't ask those questions. They're operating more along the lines of, why is he wearing that? So they don't, right? It's more of a culturally determined set of standards. It's not a logical rule system that you can easily explain. So we have lots of things like that, and that helps us move our way into and through. We'll get to atonement. I'll spend some time on that next week. We're pushing up on time, so I want to move us through. I hate slideshows. I'm terrible at doing them. I wanted you to be able to see this, hopefully it'll help sort of illustrate it, and I can walk through it quickly. But this always feels to me, the color coding is supposed to help distinguish things, but it just feels to me like a 5th grade school project that my daughter would do, or one of my boys, and it's like, they do better slideshows than I do. So, but if you take a look, this is sort of a simplified version of how to understand this. Over here you have the holy. If a thing is holy, that means God has granted it sacred, he has sanctified it. So the arrow going from the big green circle, that's just common stuff. So an Israelite, by definition of the fact that they're an Israelite, Israelites are more holy than the nations, than the Gentiles, because God has taken them as his people, right? He owns them, right? That's the idea of leaving the slavery of Pharaoh and coming to be slaves of Yahweh. So all Israelites are holy in distinction from, or in contradistinction to the Gentiles. But within the camp of Israel, Israelites are common compared to entering into the sanctuary where only the priests could go, because the priests are sanctified. So that arrow going from common to holy, it can happen. God, there's usually a ritual process, some sort of ceremony, something has to happen, but an object, a person, a place, or a time can be sanctified and then it becomes holy. If you are in, your default state is clean, right? Is common and clean. And there's nothing wrong with being common and clean. Which means you are not fit for sacred space, you can't go in there. But since you're clean, you can bring your offering to the tabernacle court, to the altar, and then the priest who is holy can offer the sacrifice and apply the blood on your behalf, and then you can get acceptance by God or whatever. They're different. We'll talk about the individual sacrifices and offerings and what they do and the logic of them next week. But you can do that. If you are an Israelite and you wake up and dang, there's a dead mouse on the floor of the tent. Well, you got to get that thing out of there. That's a little tricky. Touching a corpse is defiling. Or you're a woman, you wake up and you felt fine when you went to bed, but you woke up and, right? Monthly cycle. You can't go to the sanctuary. That is a defiling state. You're in a state of defilement. Again, you didn't do anything wrong. It's not a moral judgment. You've just become impure. So, for the duration of the menstrual cycle, you just can't visit sacred space. You're not punished. Nobody comes after you and is mean to you for it. You just can't go into sacred space because that loss of blood is seen as loss of life in the symbolic, right, typological system. And that would be bringing a sort of death and disorder into God's place of life and order. Does that follow? That's a good. There are other examples, but that's a pretty easy one to sort of grasp. What about when you're done with your cycle and there's no more menstrual blood? And okay, now I would really like to bring my offering. I'd like to go visit God's house. It's to go from impure over to pure is usually something like a bath. You just ritually wash. Right? You have the mikvah baths of the first century. That's what a lot of this was doing. Women would do mikvah baths probably more frequently, I think, than men. But the idea there is like, yes, you undergo it's called an ablution, a washing ceremony. Maybe think of it as a baptism. Hebrews uses that term. But it's just a washing. And usually you change clothes, you're good. To get from impure to pure, usually not a big deal. There are exceptions. There are major impure acts that are moral transgressions. That's a different story, but we'll get to that. But for a basic bodily defilement, let's say, you usually just wash, and once the stated period of time that you have to wait is over, like childbirth, good example. After, you see this in the Gospels actually, when Mary gives birth to Jesus, she has a certain amount of time before she can bring him to the temple to be dedicated, then she does. Brings the offering, etc. That's normal ritual procedure. And it just follows this logic. So you can go from impure to pure rather easily. Then once you're pure, you can go to the level of holiness that's appropriate to you, right? And that's kind of, in short version, how the system works. If something is sanctified and it gets profaned, if something that wasn't authorized comes into contact with it, for example, then it's profaned. Then you got to get it out of the holy place. It can't be there. That's a breach. So it goes back to common. Doesn't mean you like burn it or destroy it or throw things at it and curse at it. It just means it's common now. Can't use it in God's sacred territory. He doesn't own it anymore in the same way, or he doesn't make use of it. Can't make use of it in the same way. The big danger is that the impure comes into contact with the holy. That is the absolute no-no of the entire system. If something impure contacts something holy, it's not just that the holy thing will become profane. It's it's actually dangerous for impurity to contact holiness. The thing that's impure risks death. In fact, almost certain death. You get to this in a couple of examples, but that's just the logic of it. It is the thing that cannot happen, right? So that's why all these procedures are important. It's not about, here are all the rules you have to follow if you want this to go well for you, and I'll have something to do with you. It's more about protecting sacred space, maintaining the holiness of that space, and protecting the people, right? I mentioned this last week. If you just wandered up after Adam is exiled from the garden, and God posts the cherubim at the garden with their flaming swords, if you just strolled up to there, like if Abel decides, instead of offering God something here at this altar, I'm just going to try to make a run for it and get back in there, it won't work. You came from a realm of death, right, and defilement. You came now from this realm of non-order or chaos and disorder and death. You can't just run back into sacred space. Not because God is offended by that, although that's part of it, but because you will die. Don't do it, right? It's a protection for the common and the impure that they're not allowed in there. It's not just, these are God's mean rules, and he makes sure to impose them. So, how are we on time here? Let's see. Okay. Let me pick up one more example of actually starting in Leviticus from chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, and then we'll go through the individual offerings and sacrifices starting next week. And again, I'll read, this is on your handout, and also we'll have it again available next week. The very opening of Leviticus 1, verse 2. It gets translated differently, but it's usually something like, if anyone, or when any one of you brings an offering to Yahweh, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock. That's the very beginning of Leviticus. Actually, the first verse is, Yahweh called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, which picks right up at the end of Exodus, right? It's best to read Leviticus as just an extension of what's going on the mountain in Exodus. This is one of the downsides of like chapter breaks and partitioning books out from each other. This is really one story. So Yahweh called to Moses, and here's what he's going to tell Moses to instruct the people. But the Hebrew here is very instructive. So it's, again, forgive me, a little bit pedantic, but these details really matter to start us off in understanding what's going on when we get to some of the individual offerings and just what's this whole ritual process about. It literally says something like, let me pull up the inner linear here. The first word in this series is Adam, a human, right? But it's the name Adam. Just keep that in mind. We're talking about the Garden of Eden and the replay of the Mount Sinai experience being a replay of the Garden of Eden. This verse literally says, if an Adam, right? If Adam, if a human comes near, and the word for coming near is kariv, yakriv. To come near, this is the verb. He comes near with and it usually gets translated as offering, but the basic word for offering is just a noun form of this verb, karav. So it's something like coming near with his near bringing, or his offering of coming near, right? In other words, the whole point of the offering is just the thing that gets you near to God. Does that make sense? Have I explained it well enough? The Hebrew is unambiguous here. Like, it is just versions of the same root. So the Jews come to call offerings korbanot. An offering is a korban, but korban just means something that brings you near, or a coming near. It picks up the action of approaching. It's an approach offering, if you want to think about it that way. So don't just think of the sort of mechanical act of here's the offering, like a transaction. It's not just that. It is actually more like, think of a royal throne room. If you want to appeal to the king, or if the king has summoned you, you don't, there's a whole lot of ceremony and trepidation around how you approach and whether you approach, right? Do you ever see, there's an old HBO miniseries, John Adams, based on the book. It's a fantastic book. There's this whole brilliant scene where Adams is, for some period, our ambassador to England, right? And he's way out of his element. And there's this whole beautifully acted scene with Paul Giamatti of how he's supposed to enter the room where the king is seated, and he's terribly nervous about it and uncomfortable, and the whole thing is very accurate to how this would work. But the very grammar, the vocabulary of the start of Leviticus talking about, okay, when you guys bring your offerings, here's what's going to happen. Even the vocabulary of this as a starting point is telling you something. It's indicating all of this is for the purpose of people being near to Yahweh's presence, right? Not just, here are the rules and you better follow them. It is a near bringing experience. It is a coming near experience. It is an approach to the God who dwells in this place, and we are hoping that he will accept us. But this is the way he has appointed it to work. So how much of ancient Israelite worship would have been fear-based, and how much would have understood they have a real opportunity in God's grace to be in a relationship with him as a community? It's both in some ways, but it's not always just one thing or the other as we might think about it. And so in anyways, the very language here indicates that. Oh, sorry, I put this up on the slide if you want to see sort of how it unfolds. And then, let me end with this. Back to Hebrews. This would be it's a powerful verse when we read it. We also know the power of it. Put it in the context of ancient Israelite worship at the Tabernacle, and it is very hard to fathom, right? It would sound almost ridiculous. Therefore, brothers, Hebrews 10:19, since we have confidence, boldness to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us approach. This would be in Hebrew the same idea. Let us karav, let us come near, draw near, with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. All of that is tabernacle language and imagery. But the idea, number one, that you can come near to the cosmic sanctuary is just remarkable to think about. But that you would do so with boldness and not with trepidation is unfathomable. It's almost hard to put into words beyond what just the author has said here, right? And you get that sense of, and Hebrews is consistent about this. He says, you approach with boldness, but also our God is a consuming fire. And if they didn't get away with it, when they didn't listen to him who spoke, all right, on earth, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, right? You see the tension even in the new covenant idea that Hebrews is talking about. There is still this dual reality of God's holiness sanctifies us and allows us to come into his presence. We belong to him, which means we belong where he is, yet he is still dangerous because of that holiness. It's this remarkable paradox of reality that we just have to live in. But this encouragement is just remarkable. And it is picking up exactly Leviticus's vocabulary. It just has amplified and expanded it to levels that I think an ancient Israelite familiar with the temple system and how the tabernacle was set up would just have a hard time comprehending. And obviously some of them did. That's why Hebrews is written. They're like, what?
They still do.
Are you sure? And he's like, yeah, I'm sure. Boldness, man. We live this reality. Live it. Anyway.
And the boldness is not predicated on the person, because it was always the perfection of the sacrifice itself, not the person who gave this. It was the lamb that had to be perfect.
Yeah, you could be confident if you're bringing your offering,
right,
that even though, man, this is the place I'm not sure I'm safe in because God's presence is there and that's dangerous, but he has said this is the way to do it. And if I bring my offering, Leviticus sort of assumes the worshiper is pure of heart, right? It doesn't command any of that. It's not like this was just a mechanical process. If they did this, God accepted it. No, that is again the way pagan worship typically worked. They thought of it as mechanistic, as sort of like, if we do the ritual, the gods will probably hear, or they're obligated to hear. They will respond. We'll get their attention, right? They love the smell of this burning smoke. Yahweh does too. That's the point of contact. But it was not the case that if you just brought the offering and really didn't care about the thing you did wrong, you didn't really confess it or try to make it right, you did something, we'll get into some of this next week, but it wasn't the case, then your offering was meaningless. And God says this over and over again in the prophets all the time. They talk about the offerings becoming something that he loathes, that he won't accept. He's explicit about it. Why? Not because they weren't doing it right, because their hearts were far from him, and because they didn't offer wholeheartedly what he had instructed them to do. So they did the right thing as instructed, but not for the right reasons. And it just didn't work that way. Leviticus, all of this assumes the motives are intact. It is a relationship. The people want to honor Yahweh, love him, want to be in his presence, and will have properly repented and confessed anything that they need to make right before they then go with the offering. And Hebrews is just picking this up. We can come near boldly, but we can do so, as Larry points out, not because you got it all figured out, or because now you're worthy of it, whereas you couldn't be made worthy in this system, but just because the sacrifice merits so much more in terms of intimacy and in terms of this kinds of wholeness and purification, as Hebrews will talk about, that the holy high priest is doing the interceding. He's the representative, and the sacrifice is also his blood. So it's like the way you can lose, right? It just amplifies and elevates everything. In any case, that's just the tip. That's the iceberg tip of Leviticus getting underway. But you see right away with this idea of coming near, how much more of a relational system it might be than just maybe how a lot of people grew up thinking about it, which was just, here are the rules you follow, and you do these, kind of weird things, and then maybe God accepts you. It's a lot richer than that, much thicker, much deeper. And so I hope that'll be a good starting point. Next week we'll pick right up, stay in Leviticus 1, and we'll go through the offerings. I think I put them all in a list on your handout. You can read about any of those if you want. You can bring questions before we start next week if you want to, frame how we discuss this, and I'll try to explain it as we go through each of those, and then we'll take us into some of the deeper symbolism, and then in the final week we'll do a little quick touchdown on the temple, the Solomon's temple, and its continuity with the tabernacle and also its differences, and then we'll get to the New Testament realities as they present these ideas. And we've got a glimpse of it here in Hebrews, but there's a lot more of this in the New Testament actually. So that'll be kind of our plan of attack from here forward. Lord, thank you for the time you give us here. We pray that it will be insightful and help us to understand things better from your word, but also we pray that we can take some of these ideas and in our meditating on them and in our thinking about it, try to make them actually, through your spirit, empowering us, try to make them relevant in the way that we serve you, in the way that we represent you, and in how we live out our lives as your witnesses and your people thank you for the privilege of being in your presence in a way that is far beyond our reckoning to understand. We're grateful for your word. We're grateful for the time you give us here, and we pray that you'll bless our evening. In Christ's name, amen. I need to go. Feel free to dismiss. Sorry about the tech problems earlier, so we started late. If you want to stick around, you have any questions, you can